Hi there, me again. In today's video, we're going to be talking about one of the most affordable and one of the most versatile lenses you can add to your lens kit, and that is a vintage macro lens. But first, I need to make some coffee, so I'm going to go out and make myself a cup of coffee and record the whole process with just this lens. Then when I get back, we can talk about some of the advantages and some of the disadvantages to vintage macro lenses. So let's get to brewing. Alright, I've got my coffee made, got my notes here. Let's talk about some vintage macro lens stuff. So, this video is going to be more about vintage macro lenses in general, but just to give you guys a little bit more detail about mine, it is a Vivitar 55mm f2.8 macro lens, and it's an FD mount. And I've got an FD to Sony E-mount adapter because I use Sony E-mount cameras. So let's start with the advantages. So I think the first and most obvious advantage to macro lenses is you can focus super close, and the types of shots that you can get with macro lenses are just so unique and so different from any other focal length or type of lens that you can buy. The fact that you can get so close to your subjects just gives kind of an otherworldly perspective to your footage, and I think that's really cool. Another nice advantage about shooting with macro lenses, especially when it comes to video, is you don't really need an ND filter. And that's because when you have your lens barrel fully extended and you're focusing super close, you lose a lot of light. And you also typically have to stop your aperture down because the depth of field gets really shallow and almost unusable if you're shooting wide open. So that cuts way down on your light, and you don't really need to use an ND filter, which means it's a lot more handy to just pull out a macro lens and switch it really easily from your normal lens, and you don't have to worry about unscrewing and rescrewing ND filters, and it just makes the whole process pretty fast and pretty seamless for getting B-roll. Another nice little benefit to macro lenses is the front lens elements are recessed pretty far down into the lens barrel. That kind of creates a built-in lens hood, and you don't typically get a lot of flaring with most macro lenses. So that's really useful when it comes to getting really clean images and videos. So this next advantage doesn't necessarily go for all macro lenses, but a lot of macro lenses are very usable when you're not shooting macro photography. Most macro prime lenses are between 50 and 80 millimeters, and that's a very usable field of view for a lot of different subjects. And not all, but a lot of macro lenses, including this one, have a maximum aperture somewhere around f2.8, and that's really usable for portraits and things like that. Another thing that makes macro lenses really usable for more general purpose photography is the fact that as you get closer to infinity, the focus throw becomes very short. So with this lens as an example, the focus throw from infinity to 1 meter is about 45 degrees, which is very nice for something like street photography, where you need to be focusing very fast. Another thing about vintage macro lenses, especially macro primes, is they're typically really sharp. So if you're just in need of an affordable, sharp lens, a macro lens is a great way to go. Okay, now let's talk about some disadvantages. The first big disadvantage that I can see, especially for video, is focus breathing. Macro lenses typically have terrible focus breathing, and that's not personally something that bothers me, but I know it does bother a lot of videographers. So if you're thinking about using a macro lens for more general footage, take that into consideration. Another disadvantage, we talked about the focus throw being super short, close to infinity, but once you get into the macro range, the focus throw becomes very, very long. I think you have to turn the focus ring on this lens something like 720 degrees before you get to the minimum focusing distance. So that can be a problem if you're looking to record footage and track a moving object or something like that. Vignetting is another thing that you can run into that could potentially be a negative for you. But honestly, if you're focusing in the macro range, the shots are so unique that vignetting is a lot less noticeable than in more normal footage or photos. So it's not something that I'm super worried about with my macro lenses, but definitely something to note. Okay. Now that we've talked about the advantages and disadvantages, let's talk about some buying tips. So the first buying tip I have is to look for a 1-to-1 macro lens. So there's different degrees of macro lenses and macro photography, but 1-to-1 typically denotes the closest focusing you can get with macro lenses. And that means the object you're focusing on will be life size on the image sensor. So if you really want as close shots as possible, look for a 1-to-1 macro. So the second tip I have in terms of buying vintage macro lenses is to look for macro prime lenses. There are zoom lenses out there that have macro capabilities, but they're typically not quite as sharp, and they collect a lot more internal dust because they have those focusing rings as well as zoom rings. So if you're trying to get the best possible lens for your money, I would stick with a prime. So that's about it for this video. Hopefully, after listening to me ramble about the advantages and disadvantages of vintage macro lenses, you'll go out and pick one of these up for yourself and add some unique perspectives to your photography and some added production quality to your videos. Other than that, I've got some really interesting videos coming up. I've got some cool cameras that I'm going to test out and a new film scanner that I am excited to talk to you about. And yeah, just some cool stuff coming up in the future. I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye now.